Open up our Bibles to Luke 7. Luke chapter 7. That is where we will begin. Now, there is a story here that Jesus, in the midst of his ministry, is engaged in. And he is invited to a dinner by one of the Pharisees. He's invited into the Pharisee's home. And then the situation, which is quite familiar to most of us, is unfolded within these verses. So let's go ahead and read Luke chapter 7, beginning at verse 36. And one of the Pharisees desired that he would eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and sat down to eat. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat to eat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment and stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with oil or with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee which invited him saw it, he spoke within himself, saying, "This man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that touches him, for she is a sinner." Verse 40. And Jesus answering said to him, "Simon, I have somewhat to say unto you." And he said, "Master, say on." There was a certain creditor which had two debtors. The one owed 500 pence and the other 50. When they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him most? Verse 43. Simon answered and said, "I suppose that he to whom he forgave most." And he said to him, "You have rightly judged." And he turned to the woman and he said to Simon, "See this woman? I entered into your house. You gave me no water for my feet. She washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. You gave me no kiss. But this woman, since the time I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil you did not anoint. This woman has anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little." And he said unto her, "Your sins are forgiven." And they that sat to eat with him began to say within themselves, "Who is this that forgives sins also?" And he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." That last verse of that text is the foundational point that I want to bring to your attention this morning. Your faith has saved you. Now, the whole story is one that is so clear that it's difficult for us to not understand. I think that, however, it is not always easy to keep these kinds of things in mind, always to keep them with us, to carry them with us. But pretty much what we have is a woman who had a certain realization that Simon didn't have. There was a different realization. And in her mind, because of what she was able to see, I think that is a major key to the understanding of the text. She was able to see something that Simon was not able to see. We are familiar with certain statements such as we live by faith and not by sight. Paul made that statement in 2 Corinthians. There's also statements like when Jesus healed the blind man, and he used this healing of a blind man to teach the Pharisees a lesson on their inability to see their actual circumstances. This woman was in a situation where she was able to see much more clearly than this Pharisee. And now Jesus, because of the activity that she was engaged in, re-rehearses the situation for him, re-explaining everything that they had all just witnessed. Now, of course, the Pharisee was thinking that this is ridiculous what's happening. Jesus is indeed praising what's happening. Because what she is actually doing is she is actually going out of her way. She is, in a certain sense, exaggerating the normal customs of the time. In a certain way, you would even be able to conclude that she is embarrassing herself, even belittling her own self. Jesus used the more normal customs of the time to describe what the Pharisee didn't do, which I think is interesting. The very first thing, he didn't give him water for his own feet. Now, that was a custom of the day. Now, this woman didn't just hand Jesus water to clean his own feet. Now, that would have been at least the very least that this Pharisee could have done as far as customs were concerned. But instead, she actually uses her own tears and then wipes her tears off of his feet with her hair. And after re-rehearsing and witnessing all this, Jesus then turns his attention to the woman. And this is a pivotal moment that is what I want us to be able to focus in on today. There is something that drew Jesus's attention, and he describes it in detail. But then he condenses it all with this one statement in verse 50. Your faith has saved you. Now I want you and me and all of us to allow ourselves to focus in on the significance of that statement and what Jesus has actually been able to make clear to this woman which is a message that has been recorded for us to be able to read to this day. I'm going to take you to another text in just a moment, but stop and think about your faith for a moment and what it actually does for you. For there is deep and rich benefits to your faith. Now, the comparison is often difficult to discern. What I mean by comparison is the overall theme of the scriptures from the beginning to the end can all more or less be wrapped up in the tension between two elements within, is it not? There's the flesh and there's the spirit. When you consider the way the Apostle Paul describes and writes about the spirit in Romans chapter 8, he talks about how we are not debtors to the flesh, but to the spirit. And how to walk in the flesh is actually animosity with God, but to walk in the spirit is life, peace. And the same thing is described in the Galatian epistle. Chapter 5, he talks about the lusts of the flesh versus the fruit of the spirit. Now, what's happening here is there is a comparison that I want you to really focus in with me on as we consider what Jesus was telling this woman when he said, "Your faith has saved you." He was bringing the attention and the actual praise. He actually gives a certain type of praise to this woman. And the acknowledgement or the approval to her faith. And this is in comparison with the flesh. The flesh could not and would not save her. One of the reasons why this is so difficult for us to keep in mind is because the two are incompatible. The two are constantly at odds. And this blindness problem that I was just describing is a problem that we have merely just because it's really difficult to be able to see the problem. It's a matter of difficulty because we just simply can't see it. So I'm going to take you now to Hebrews chapter 10. And as we go to Hebrews chapter 10, the first thing I'm going to read with you is the last verse in the chapter, verse 39. Hebrews 10 and verse 39. And then we're going to examine the context a little bit. And you'll see Romans 10 and verse 39 relates well to the story we just read about the woman. Hebrews 10 verse 39, it says, "We are not of them who draw back unto destruction, but of them that believe to the saving of the soul. You can see the parallel aspect there. Jesus telling this woman, your faith has saved you, actually forgiving her sins in that moment. The Hebrew author makes the statement right here. We are to be as those who believe to the saving of the soul. Because your faith indeed saves you. I'd like you to examine the context with me and extract with me the purpose and some of the rich qualities that this can bring to us today. Hebrews 10, verse 35. I'm going to read to the end of the chapter. Hebrews 10, 35 to 39 says, cast not away, therefore, your confidence, which has great recompense of reward. We have need of perseverance, that after you have done the will of God, you might receive the promise. For yet a little while, he that shall come will come, will not tarry. But the just shall live by faith. But if any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. We are not of them who draw back into destruction, but them that believe to the saving of the soul. Now, woven into this set of just 5 verses, there is the idea of hanging on tight to your faith. It uses the word confidence to supplement our idea of faith. It uses the word perseverance in verse 36 to supplement our idea of faith. It uses the words draw back or casting away. Draw back is used twice to help us to ourselves on the straight and narrow, and to not go back to things that are of the flesh, but to make sure that we are always moving toward our faith, always going with faith over anything else. And this is very significant because flesh, as we shall see, is always going to lead us in the wrong direction, always going to bring us doubt. But here, verse 37, he says, yet a little while, and he that shall come will come and not tarry, but the just shall live by faith. Keep in mind now that is a quote from the minor prophet Habakkuk. Habakkuk was a prophet sent to warn the children of Israel, or actually Judah, rather, of the coming Babylonians. And the moment that this statement was made or recorded was a moment when Habakkuk was waiting for a message from God. And the message came to him, and he was told that the coming of the Lord is sure. And that's what verse 37 is saying. When he's coming, he's coming. Then verse 38, he offers a very important message which can actually have a dual meaning for us. That is this, the dual meaning. Now, whether or not the interpretation of this is to actually mean that we will live physically by faith, now that is something that has been true many times throughout history, many times throughout the biblical story. Many times people had been healed of their illness. Many times people had even been resurrected from the dead, living by their faith. But the more deeper or the richer meaning behind this is that we are to spiritually and within our mind and in our heart live by faith, live through faith. We need to be living a faithful life always. That is the deeper and richer meaning here. And then what this is doing is it is telling us exactly how significant that faith is. And it is not to be compared to the flesh. The flesh is not where our faith is to be. This faith, as we have just noticed in Luke 7 and here in Hebrews 10, is to the salvation of our souls, which he will then elaborate moving into Hebrews chapter 11. So go with me into Hebrews 11, where it says in verse 1, now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And then we have the very majestically and wonderfully written chapter that we, or I often refer to and have been heard of it referred to as the Hall of Faith. And he goes into the way that faith has delivered so many people under the Old Testament during times of great difficulty in their lives. What this faith did was it provided something that was beyond the flesh. This is a theme that I think must be emphasized, not necessarily exclusive to the times in which we live now, for it is never obsolete. However, this is something that I think is to be ringing very loud and true for us in this particular time. It's something that I want to be emphasized for us because we must be able to see beyond the flesh. We must be able to grow beyond the flesh. In other words, we must, as disciples of Christ, transcend this life. We must look toward heaven and have the discipline of a heart and mind to keep our eyes looking up to heaven. We cannot afford to be hanging out down here. We must have the strength and the discipline to do this. For this is what sustains us. There's a proverb that says, the spirit of man sustains him through his infirmity. There's another place where we are told that God, with the same spirit that he resurrected Jesus with, is able to quicken our mortal bodies. So if we are stuck looking at the things that mess with us or the things that distract us here, then our faith is failing to save us in these matters. And that is what was the difference between the woman in our story in Luke 7 and the Pharisee. The Pharisee couldn't see it, but this woman could. In Hebrews 11, he continues on. I'm going to begin in verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. By it the elders obtained a good report. Verse 3, through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts. By it he, being dead, yet speaks. By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony that he pleased God. So I'll just stop and think about that for a second. Because of faith, those that have passed on, the elders, as they are described with in verse 2, obtained a good report. So this is what I want to do with the remainder of the lesson. And in doing so, simply feed your faith. Because I'm going to work under the assumption, the educated assumption indeed, that your faith has made you whole. And I'll work under the truth unfolded for us in the scriptures that each of you here, though we all have our struggles, I'm going to operate now under the this fact laid out for us in scriptural perspective, that your faith has saved you. So we can move on and actually read this text, not as if it's some old-time mythological story that is this has this mysterious essence to it that for us is so long ago in such a different culture that it's difficult for us to even relate to. We want these things to come alive to us because that's what faith does for us. It's the substance of things hoped for. It's actually the stuff that hope is made out of. There's the DMV right there, right? The Dave Matlock version of Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the stuff hope is made of. And then the evidence of things that aren't seen. And none of you seen the elders obtain a good report. None of you seen it with your own eyes, but you know what happened. And therefore you know what happened for you because you believe. None of you was there when Abel offered his sacrifice, believing in God, having faith in God's instruction, having faith in what God told him what to do, and therefore, by faith, living in obedience. None of you was there, but you know what happened. That's why each of you has had the faith to do what God says. Therefore, your faith has saved you. And none of you was there when Enoch didn't even have to see death, but somehow this little amoeba, not to be belittling or insulting in any way to Enoch, but what was Enoch? Just a pitiful human like the rest of us. However, he found a way to please God. I find it hard to please my own family sometimes. You know what I'm talking about? However, Enoch, because he believed in God, God looked down at him with pleasure. He pleased him. And likewise, the scripture speaks to you and me today, just like Abel yet speaks, as we just read, though he be dead. You can please God also with your faith. Here's one of the problems. Flesh doubts. Flesh fears. Flesh seeks fascination of the things down here. Flesh likes, nay, loves money. Flesh loves pleasure. Flesh does all kinds of stuff. And these are all things that we all struggle with day in, day out. That's why this message is so beautiful. Because you are able to put your faith over your flesh. Because you, through these words and through these stories, are able to put your faith even over your feelings. And I struggle to find the words to expound upon the significance of that power. The words, of course, have been spoken, as we have just read. But it's just one of those things that has been all up in my face and all up in many of our faces. And the reason why is because for about 48 hours, I felt miserable physically. There might even be some here who are experiencing difficulties in their particular circumstance, whatever it may be. Maybe some are even struggling with the fact that we aren't meeting physically at this exact moment. But whatever that struggle, whatever that feeling is real. Because the feeling of a sore throat was quite real just a moment ago. The feeling of depletion of energy was quite real. However, through faith, I was able to see something bigger than anything that I felt. And isn't that one of the biggest problems or one of the biggest struggles with so many humans that I at least have heard myself? One of the biggest complaints or one of the biggest struggles that I have heard amongst people. I've heard people say things like, why is it still this way? I just prayed. The feeling is valid. The feeling is real. But the faith surpasses that feeling. Because you know that there's something, that the faith opens up a whole reality. And that's another beautiful application of the first verse of Hebrews 11 that we just read. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith, your faith is what determines your reality. Your faith is what determines what is actually real to you. I've even heard somebody describe it like this life is really just kind of a dream. In fact, I wrote a sermon about it not too long ago. Well, like 13 years ago, or even longer than that now. It was called The Reality. And the reason why I wrote the sermon was because I was in a moment in my life when I started to come to this realization, I came to this this reality that sweet mercy, this life really is just a vapor that appears for a short time and quickly vanishes away. This life really is just this blip in our existence, and faith is what opens the door to me to be able to actually reach for what is truly the reality. And because of that, just like Jesus said, just like this woman realized that her situation, her reality situation, was that she was indebted to Jesus, so much so that she was willing to allow herself to be belittled in the flesh. And Jesus' response, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So today, keep in mind, now on, keep in mind for always, make sure your faith is above your flesh. Make sure your faith is above your feelings. Make sure your faith is above your fears. Not that it removes those things completely. Because it doesn't. But it transcends those things. Chew on that for a while. Think about that, meditate upon that. The significance of your faith, how important and powerful it is to you, especially considering the fact that no one has any right to it but you and you alone. So I invite you now to really contemplate and think about these things. Contemplate your own salvation, of course, by testing and thinking about your faith. The Apostle Paul actually wrote the words in 2 Corinthians, examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. Prove your own selves. So I offer you the same challenge as Paul did, and keep those things in mind. And if you have any need to respond to the gospel call, I guess I'll just, dip myself in a hand sanitizer because your salvation is more important, I guess. But if you need to be baptized, let me know while we stand and sing. Or